The church smelled of white roses and cruelty. Eliza Vane sat in the third pew from the back, the last place anyone of consequence would think to look for her, which was precisely why she had chosen it. Around her, silk gowns rustled and whispered like conspirators. Laughter drifted up from the front of the nave, bright and careless, the kind of laughter that belongs to people who have never once been made to feel small. At the altar stood Thomas Aldred, the man who had once pressed her hand to his chest and said that she was the only steadiness he had ever known. He was watching his new bride descend the aisle, beautiful, wealthy, titled, with an expression of uncomplicated joy that Eliza had never once inspired in him. She had suspected it for years. Today, she was made absolutely certain. She had told herself she came only to close the chapter. To sit quietly in the back, observe the ending of what had never truly begun, and leave with her dignity intact. Then someone in the front row turned and saw her. Then someone else. Then came the whispers, and the stares, and the slow, poisonous wave of recognition that moved through the congregation like a tide she could not outrun. She was rising, already moving toward the door, cheeks burning, when a hand closed gently but firmly around her arm, large, gloved, utterly still, and a voice, low as a held note, spoke directly into her ear. "Pretend you are mine," he said. "Unless you would prefer to walk out of this church alone." She turned. The Duke of Ashfern looked down at her with eyes the color of winter slate, and he was not smiling. She had not always been the sort of woman who needed rescuing. Eliza Vane had grown up in the household of a country solicitor who prized precision above warmth, which meant she had learned early how to be useful rather than beloved. She could manage accounts before she could embroider. She could read a contract before she had mastered a sonata. These were not the accomplishments that drew young men to a woman's side in a drawing room, but they were the kind that kept a household upright when everything else tilted sideways. And she had carried that skill like a quiet inheritance all her life. Thomas Aldred had found her useful, too. For 3 years, he had circled her, attending the same modest assemblies in Wiltshire, sharing borrowed books across her father's garden gate, pressing increasingly intimate letters into her keeping. She had believed, with the particular stubbornness of a practical woman who rarely allowed herself to believe in much at all, that this was love. When he stopped calling, she told herself he was busy. When his letters slowed, she told herself he was traveling. When the announcement appeared in the Wiltshire Gazette 6 months ago, Thomas Aldred, Esq., to wed Miss Cecily Broughton, daughter of Viscount Harrow, she had read it 3 times with the expression of someone reviewing an incorrect column of figures, as though repetition might produce a different sum. It did not. She had packed what remained of that chapter into a very small space inside herself and set it aside. She had continued working. She had continued managing her father's books after his death 2 winters ago had left her without a home and without a guardian, dependent on the thin charity of a distant cousin in Bath who thought her useful for unpaid correspondence and little else. The invitation to the wedding had arrived by mistake. Thomas had once given her address to a mutual acquaintance, and someone, insufficiently careful with the guest list, had sent it through. She should have returned it unopened. She had not. She had told herself that attending was the act of a composed, rational woman. She had told herself she felt nothing. The church had immediately disproved her. And so she had been sitting in the third pew from the back, invisible and absolutely miserable, when Lord Sebastian Voss, the Duke of Ashfern, had appeared beside her like something carved from cold stone and winter smoke. She knew him by reputation rather than acquaintance. Most people did. He was the kind of man whose name was spoken in drawing rooms with a particular drop in the voice, not with fear exactly, but with something adjacent to it. He had served in the Peninsular War and returned changed, they said. He had inherited his dukedom at 26 amid a tangle of debt and scandal not of his own making. He had resolved it without charm and without apology, and the severity of his methods had earned him a reputation for ruthlessness that he appeared, from everything she had observed, entirely unbothered by. They had met properly only once, at an assembly in Bath the previous winter, for approximately 4 minutes, during which he had been searching for someone else and she had been directing him toward the correct card room. He had looked at her with the polite blankness of a man who would not remember the encounter, and she had thought nothing further of it. He had apparently remembered more than she expected. "You knew who I was," she said now, as he guided her out of the pew with a calm authority that discouraged argument from anyone watching. "I remember useful people," he said quietly. It was not a compliment, exactly. But the congregation was watching them both, and the whispers had taken on an entirely different character, and the expression on Thomas Aldred's face, just briefly, just for a fraction of a second as he glanced back from the altar, had shifted into something startled and almost wounded. Eliza Vane straightened her spine and took the Duke's arm. The church steps were cold under the November sky, and the moment they cleared the doors, she attempted to withdraw her hand. He did not immediately release it. "You are shaking," he said. It was an observation, not a kindness. "I am perfectly well," she said, which was the kind of thing one said when one was very far from perfectly well but had insufficient interest in being examined further. He studied her for a moment with those unreadable gray eyes. She had the uncomfortable sensation of being assessed, not as a woman is often assessed at a social occasion, which is to say decoratively, but practically. The way one might assess a structure for its load-bearing capacity. "Walk with me," he said. "There is a carriage on the lane. We will draw enough attention from the windows to satisfy anyone who is looking, and then I will take you wherever you wish to go." She considered refusing. She considered telling him that she did not require assistance and that she was quite capable of summoning a hired cab and removing herself from the situation with perfect independence. She considered several things, none of which changed the fact that she had arrived by a borrowed cart, her cousin's housekeeper's cart, which had already departed. And that she had no realistic plan for the next several hours beyond a long and cold walk into the village. "That is very practical of you," she said at last. "I am a practical man," he replied. They walked slowly enough to be seen and quickly enough to suggest destination. In the carriage, he sat across from her in silence, and she looked out of the window at the bare hedgerows and the low gray sky and told herself, firmly and with considerable discipline, that she was not going to cry in a duke's carriage. She had decided this before they reached the end of the lane. By the time they reached the village, she had largely succeeded. "You do not have to explain yourself to me," he said, without looking up from the window on his side. "I was not planning to," she said. A pause. Good. She was not certain whether this was sympathy or simply indifference. With him, it seemed genuinely difficult to tell. She found, unexpectedly, that this indifference was easier to bear than pity would have been. Pity, she thought, would have undone her entirely. She spent the following 3 weeks at her cousin's house in Bath, managing correspondence, economizing on coal, and refusing to think about the church. She wrote 2 letters to acquaintances about possible positions as a companion or household secretary. She received 1 reply, which suggested she was overqualified, which was the gentlest possible way of saying unwanted. The second reply came not from an acquaintance, but from a solicitor. The letter was formal, precise, and entirely unexpected. It informed Miss Elizabeth Vane that the Duke of Ashfern was in search of a capable estate manager for Ashfern Hall, his ancestral seat in Northumberland. A property he did not personally occupy but which required urgent administrative attention. The position was unconventional for a woman, the letter acknowledged, but the Duke was not, it seemed, a conventional man, and he had specific ideas about the sort of mind the work required. There was a salary offered. It was more than generous. It was, in fact, enough to solve 3 of the immediate problems she had been quietly arranging in order of urgency each evening before sleep. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she packed her trunk. Ashfern Hall was not what she had imagined, which was unfortunate, because she had imagined something fairly grim. The hall was grimmer. It sat at the edge of a Northumberland moor like something the landscape had grown rather than built. Grey stone and narrow windows and a roof that had clearly been arguing with itself about whether to remain attached for some years. The eastern wing was uninhabitable. The kitchen garden was a tangle of frozen mud. 3 of the tenant cottages on the home farm were in visible disrepair, and the remaining household staff, a cook, 2 maids, a groundskeeper named Mr. Potts, who was approximately 70 years old and deeply skeptical of women who arrived carrying ledger books, looked at her arrival with the particular expression of people who had been disappointed by authority so many times that hope had simply stopped appearing. The Duke was not in residence. He was in London, or Edinburgh, or possibly on the continent. The solicitor's letter had not been specific. The solicitor's letter had been, in retrospect, deliberately vague on several points. Eliza set her trunk in the room she was shown, cold, drafty, with a fireplace that smoked if the wind was from the east. which in Northumberland it nearly always was, and spent the first evening reading every document she could locate in the estate office. By the end of the second day, she understood the full scope of the problem. The hall had been mismanaged not through malice but through absence. Rents had gone uncollected because no one had been sent to collect them, not because the tenants refused to pay. Repairs had been deferred until the cost of deferral exceeded the original repair fivefold. 3 suppliers had been paid twice for the same deliveries, while the kitchen had run short of staples for months. There was, buried beneath a decade of accumulated correspondence, a water rights dispute with a neighboring estate that, if resolved, would free up land for a mill that could sustain the village through the coming winter. It was, she thought, almost a relief. Problems with solutions were so much easier than the other kind. She began with the accounts. Then the rents. Then the kitchen garden, which she attacked with Mr. Potts, who had, by the 3rd week, moderated his skepticism to watchful observation, planning what could be salvaged and replanted before the deeper frost. She wrote to suppliers, corrected the doubled payments, renegotiated terms. She visited the tenant cottages herself, walking the muddy paths in her heaviest boots, talking to the farmers and their wives with the kind of straightforward, non-patronizing attention that they had apparently not received from any representative of the estate in quite some time. Mrs. Harlow, the cook, was the first to thaw. She appeared one evening in the estate office doorway with a plate of bread and a cup of tea that had not been requested, set it on the edge of the desk without comment, and departed. Eliza ate the bread without pausing in her reading and thought that this, too, was a kind of communication. By December, the eastern wing had been assessed for repair costs. By January, the water rights dispute had been drafted into a proposal she sent to the Duke's London solicitor for review. By February, 3 tenant roofs had been patched, the kitchen garden was prepared for spring planting, and every account in the ledger balanced to the penny for the first time in what Mr. Potts, unbending slightly over a shared pot of tea, estimated was approximately 11 years. She had, without intending it, made Ashfern Hall into something that functioned. She had not made it into a home. She was careful about that. It was not hers. But she had made it into something livable, and that, she thought, was enough. The Duke arrived in March. He came with no warning, or rather, with the warning of a single letter that arrived 2 days before he did, which was enough time for Mrs. Harlow to panic about the larder and for Eliza to note, with professional calm, that the guest rooms had been aired and the fires laid, and that nothing about the estate would embarrass anyone. She was reviewing drainage maps in the estate office when she heard the carriage on the gravel drive, and she did not go to the entrance hall to receive him. Because her position was estate manager and not welcoming party, and she thought it important to be precise about these distinctions. He found her, 20 minutes later, in the estate office. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she observed, without looking up from the drainage map, the particular quality of the silence that accompanies a man who expected one thing and encountered something else entirely. She looked up. He looked older than she remembered from the church, or perhaps she was simply seeing him more clearly without the noise of a congregation around him. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not come from laughter. He was still watching her with that assessing gaze, but there was something beneath it now, something calculating, recalibrating, like a compass adjusting to an unexpected north. "Miss Vane," he said. "Your Grace," she replied. "The drainage survey for the South Fields is largely complete. I have also prepared a summary of the water rights negotiation, which is at a point where it requires your signature to proceed. The tenant repair accounts are on the left side of the desk, and the kitchen garden projections for the spring planting are in the green folder." He stepped into the room. He walked, slowly, to the desk, and he looked at the organized stacks of documents, at the neatly labeled ledgers, at the wall where she had pinned a large estate map with notation pins indicating completed work, ongoing projects, and future priorities. He was silent for a long time. "You have been here 4 months," he said at last. "Yes. The solicitor's last communication with me suggested the eastern wing was habitable. It is now. It was not when I arrived. I arranged for a local builder to assess it in December and authorized the necessary repairs from the maintenance account. The cost summary is in the November ledger." He picked up the November ledger. He looked at it. He set it back down. "The water rights dispute has been pending for 9 years, he said. I am aware. The solution was not complicated. It had simply not been prioritized. She paused. With your signature, it can be resolved before summer. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had weathered a Northumberland winter and 4 months of structural disorganization and was not particularly rattled by a duke. You are angry with me, he said. It was not what she had expected him to say. I am your estate manager, she said carefully. I do not have opinions about you. That, he said quietly, is not the same as not being angry. She returned her attention to the drainage map. The South Field Survey, she said. When you have a moment. He stayed. This was, she reflected, the complication she had not fully prepared for. She had imagined the Duke as an occasional correspondent, a signature at the end of a letter, a response to a proposal, a distant authority that she reported to without frequency. She had not imagined him as a daily presence, appearing in the estate office at unexpected hours, riding the home farm with Mr. Potts, sitting at the end of the long dining table with the quiet heaviness of a man who did not know how to occupy a home. He was not easy to share space with. He had a habit of walking through rooms without announcing himself. He had another habit of standing at windows for long periods, looking at the moorland, and she never knew whether he was thinking or simply absent. He did not make demands, but his presence altered everything around him the way cold water alters the temperature of a room, gradually and completely. She was scrupulously professional. She arrived at the estate office before him. She prepared the reports before he could ask for them. She answered questions in complete sentences and did not extend conversations beyond their practical purpose. He tested this containment in small ways. The tenants at the northern farm, he said one morning, reviewing her notes from a recent visit. Mrs. Garrow. You write that her eldest boy has begun school. Yes. There was a small endowment attached to the estate for local education that had not been drawn upon in some years. I applied for it on the family's behalf. He looked up. That was beyond your original brief. It was a practical decision. An educated workforce is in the estate's long-term interest. A pause. Is that why you did it? She met his gaze. It was also, she said, after a moment, because he is a bright child, and it seemed a waste. He said nothing. But something in the set of his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a lock that has been touched by the right key but not yet turned. The first real conflict came in early April. A letter arrived from Lord Craven of the neighboring Breckfield estate, not the polite correspondence she had been managing as part of the water rights negotiation, but a blunt, insulting communication addressed to the Duke, suggesting that the water rights agreement Eliza had proposed was fraudulent in its land survey calculations, and that furthermore, Lord Craven had obtained the services of a London solicitor who would challenge any settlement in Chancery. She brought the letter to the Duke without comment. He read it. He is wrong, she said, before he could speak. The survey calculations are accurate. I supervised them personally. I can produce the original records and the surveyor's signed notes. He knows they are accurate, the Duke said. He set the letter down. This is not about the survey. Craven has wanted that mill site for a decade. He expected the dispute to remain unresolved indefinitely. He did not expect someone to actually solve it. Then we should not allow him to reopen it. He has money and legal patience. We have documentation, she said. And we have the law. He looked at her with something that was not quite respect and not quite surprise but was something in the territory between them. You are not frightened of him, he said. I am not, she agreed. I have met men like Lord Craven before. They rely heavily on the assumption that the person on the other side of the dispute will exhaust themselves before the law does. I do not exhaust easily. She was aware, as she said it, that this was perhaps the most personal thing she had volunteered to him. He appeared to be aware of it also. No, he said, quietly. I imagine you do not. The mill dispute brought them into closer daily contact than anything else had, and it was in this proximity, reviewing documents together in the estate office by lamplight, riding the disputed boundary on opposite horses in April rain, that she began to see what lay beneath the Duke's public severity. She had noticed, early on, that he did not sleep well. She was an early riser, and she heard him sometimes in the hours before dawn, walking the long corridors of the hall with a tread that was too deliberate for a man simply passing through. She had thought at first it was a habit of inspection. She understood later that it was something else. The understanding came from a letter. She had not read it intentionally. It had fallen from a stack of correspondence she was organizing for him, and it had opened as it fell, and the words at the top were already visible before she could look away. Cannot continue to carry the weight of what happened at Salamanca without destroying what remains of yourself. She had placed the letter, folded, back in the stack, and she had said nothing. But she thought about it. She thought about the way he sometimes went very still when someone raised their voice suddenly in the hall. She thought about the way he held himself slightly apart from warmth, physically, emotionally, as though proximity to something good was a risk he had stopped knowing how to calculate. She thought about what it might mean to return from a war with pieces of yourself missing that no one around you could see. She did not pity him. Pity, she had decided long ago, was what you felt for people who could not help themselves. He could help himself. He was, in fact, slowly doing so, in increments so small that she suspected he was not entirely aware of them. He had begun eating dinner at a reasonable hour rather than picking at trays in the study. He had begun speaking to the household staff by name. He had, one afternoon when she was supervising the kitchen garden, come out and stood in the early spring sunlight for a long time without apparent purpose, his coat open. His face tipped slightly upward. She had not remarked on any of it. One evening, he came to the estate office when the work was already finished and there was no practical reason for him to be there. He sat in the chair across from her desk and picked up a small book of botanical illustrations she kept as reference for the garden planning, and he turned the pages slowly. "My mother planted roses at Ashburn," he said. It was not directed at her exactly. It was the sort of statement a person makes when they are thinking aloud without entirely meaning to. "Along the south wall. They died while I was in Portugal." She set down her pen. "They can be replanted," she said. "The soil is still appropriate. I have the drainage data." He looked up. "If you would like," she added, with precision. He was quiet for a moment. "Why did you come here?" he asked at last. "To Northumberland. You could have found something closer. Something more comfortable." She considered lying, and then considered the effort of it. "I needed to be useful somewhere that was not my cousin's house," she said. "I needed work that was large enough to occupy the whole of my attention." He understood this, she thought. She could see it in the slight shift of his expression, not the understanding of someone who sympathizes from a distance, but the understanding of someone who has used the same strategy and recognized it in another. "The church," he said quietly. "In November. I want to ask whether you are." "I am," she said. "Quite recovered, thank you." He studied her. "You are protecting yourself," he said. "Yes," she said simply. "I generally do." A long silence. "Then, I was not kind to you," he said, "at the church. I mean, I offered assistance, which was perhaps useful, but the manner of it was efficient," she said. "I was going to say cold." "Efficient," she repeated, firmly. "Under the circumstances, I preferred efficiency." Something moved across his face that might, in better light, in a less guarded man, have been the beginning of a smile. The crisis, when it came, arrived on a Thursday evening in late May, in the form of a very small, very cold, very frightened child. Tommy Garrow, the bright boy from the northern farm, the one she had enrolled in the school, had been missing since midday. His mother had come to the hall in a state of quiet terror, the kind of terror that does not shout but goes very white and very still, and Eliza had left the estate office immediately, sending Mr. Potts for the Duke and the groundskeeping staff and organizing the search before anyone else had thought to suggest one. The moor was dangerous in the early summer evenings. The light went strangely, and the bogs shifted, and a child who did not know exactly which paths were firm could find himself in serious difficulty very quickly. She had searched the south field and the old mill ruin and was moving toward the eastern boundary when she heard the Duke behind her. "The bog roads," she said without turning. "He knows them well enough to be confident, which means he would have gone further than he should. The eastern boundary has two crossings that look solid this time of year but are not." "You know the moorland well," he said. "I have walked every boundary of this estate," she said. "It was necessary for the survey." They found Tommy at the second crossing, up to his knees in the peat bog, too frightened to move. The Duke went in after him without hesitation, without removing his coat, and came back out carrying the boy under one arm with the focused, methodical calm of a man who had retrieved people from worse places in worse circumstances. Tommy was not seriously hurt. Cold and shaken and profoundly embarrassed, as 8-year-old boys generally are when rescued, but whole. She watched the Duke wrap his own coat around the boy, and she noticed the steadiness of his hands, that particular, hard-won steadiness of a man who has learned to be still under pressure so completely that it has become physical, and she thought, quietly and without allowing herself to think it too fully, that he was better than his reputation suggested and worse at accepting this than almost anyone she had ever known. That night, after Tommy was returned and Mrs. Harlow had applied soup and heat and considerable emotional attention, she found the Duke in the estate office. He was standing at the window. He was not looking at anything specific. "You walked every boundary of this estate," he said, when she came in. "In winter. In Northumberland. Alone." "Yes." "Why did no one accompany you?" "I did not ask anyone to." He turned from the window. "Because you are accustomed to doing things alone," he said. She met his eyes. "It is generally more reliable," she said. "I know," he said quietly. "I have thought the same thing, for most of my life." A pause. "I was wrong to leave this place as I did. For as long as I did. The people here deserved better." She waited. "And the woman I installed to manage it," he continued, in the same careful, unwavering voice, "deserved considerably clearer terms of employment and considerably more respect than a letter from a solicitor." She was quiet for a moment. "You rescued me from a church," she said. "I think we are roughly even." "We are not," he said. "Not nearly." Outside, the May night was clear and cold, and the moorland stretched out under a thin scatter of stars, and she thought that she had, without planning to, built something here that felt more like belonging than anything she had known in a very long time. She was not sure yet what to do with this thought. She was not sure it was safe. But she did not put it away entirely. Lord Craven's legal challenge arrived the following week, and it was more serious than expected. He had retained 2 London solicitors and submitted a competing land survey that contradicted her figures on 3 key boundary points. The challenge was filed with enough authority to force a formal response within 30 days. She worked 18-hour days for 2 weeks. She cross-referenced original parish boundary documents from 1743. She found a land grant that predated Craven's own family settlement by 40 years. One that established the mill site's water rights so unambiguously that even 2 London solicitors would have difficulty arguing around it. The Duke read the document she placed before him. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "In a box in the attic," she said. "Behind a broken harpsichord. Someone had apparently used it to pack fragile items and then forgotten it was there." He looked at her steadily. "You searched the attic." "I search everywhere," she said. "It is generally more reliable." He almost smiled. This time, she was certain of it. The water rights settlement was signed in June, in Craven's own solicitor's office in Newcastle. And the expression on Lord Craven's face when the 1743 land grant was placed on the table before him was something Eliza would, she decided privately, treasure for quite some time. The Duke handled the meeting with the kind of implacable, unhurried authority that came from a man who had nothing left to prove, and on the carriage ride back to Ashfern, he was quiet for a long time in the way that was beginning to feel, to her, like a particular kind of thinking. "I had a letter from London this morning," he said, eventually. She waited. "There is a political appointment being offered. A diplomatic post in Vienna. I am being asked to consider it seriously." A pause. "It would require leaving England for a minimum of 2 years." She looked out of the window at the summer moorland, green now, unexpectedly gentle in the long afternoon light, and arranged her expression carefully. "I see," she said. "I am not going to take it," he said. She looked at him. "I have spent a great deal of my life," he said slowly, "in places that were not mine, doing things that belonged to duty rather than to me. I thought that was all I was suited for." He paused. "I was wrong." The carriage was very quiet. She could hear the wheels on the road and the breathing of the horses. "Ashfern Hall," he said, "is not simply an estate. It is not a collection of drainage surveys and tenant roofs and water rights. It is, he stopped. Tried again. You made it into something. You made it into a place that people belong to. And I have been trying, for several months now, to understand what that costs, and whether I have any right to ask whether. He stopped again. She had never seen him uncertain. She had seen him cold, and controlled, and carefully composed, and occasionally almost tender in the way of people who have learned tenderness so late that they are not quite sure of its grammar. She had not seen him uncertain. It was, she found, the most affecting thing about him. You are asking, she said carefully, whether there is something here worth staying for. I am asking, he said. Whether you would allow me to try to become someone worthy of staying. The light through the carriage window moved across his face, and she thought of the church in November, the roses. The whispers, the feeling of being absolutely alone in a room full of people. She thought of the moment he had closed his hand around her arm and offered her, not kindness exactly, but solid ground. She thought of everything she had built in this cold, beautiful, demanding place, and everything she had begun to understand about who he was beneath what the world had made of him. She thought of how long she had protected herself, and how necessary it had been, and how protection could become, over time, its own kind of prison. I would require honesty, she said. When things are difficult. When you are inclined to go cold and silent, which I know is your habit, I would require that you try instead to speak. Yes, he said. I would require that what I have built here is respected. Not merely as a function of estate management, but as something I gave to this place. It is already that, he said. It has been that for months. I should have said so sooner. She looked at him for a long time. At the church, she said quietly, you told me to pretend I was yours. Yes. I have thought about that word, she said. Pretend. He held her gaze. So have I, he said. I would not use it again. Outside, the moor rose and fell under the summer light, and the hall was visible now on the hill, grey stone and narrow windows. The south wall where she had planned to replant the roses, the kitchen garden green and ordered below, the repaired cottages in the distance, smoke rising thin and steady from their chimneys. She had made this place into something that worked. She had not made it into a home, she had told herself. It was not hers. But she had been, she understood now, entirely wrong about that. Then do not pretend, she said. He reached across the carriage and took her hand in both of his, not the firm, purposeful grip of a man guiding someone out of a church, but something quieter and more careful. The kind of holding that acknowledges it as a privilege rather than a right. No, he said. I will not. They were married in October, in the small stone church at the edge of the Ashburn village, in a ceremony attended by Mrs. Harlow and Mr. Potts and every family from the home farm, and Tommy Garrow, wearing his school clothes with the collar slightly wrong, who had appointed himself unofficial guardian of the event and took the responsibility with great seriousness. There were no white roses. She had chosen late dahlias from the kitchen garden, the last brilliant things before frost, and they filled the church with something rich and ordinary and completely beautiful. At the end of the ceremony, when the words had been said and the register signed and the small church dissolved into the kind of warmth that comes from people who are genuinely pleased for each other, the Duke leaned close and said, in the same low, even tone he had used in November, in a pew toward the back of a different church, in what felt now like another life entirely, I believe I said once, that I remember useful people. She turned to look at him. I was wrong about you, he said. You are not useful. You are necessary. There is a considerable difference, and I am sorry it took me so long to understand it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, with the particular composure of a woman who has felt this warmth building in her chest for months and has chosen, today, to stop being careful with it, you have, she allowed, begun to make up for it. He smiled then, fully, without reservation, for what she was nearly certain was the first time she had seen him do so, and she thought that this, here, in the small stone church with the autumn dahlias and the crooked collar and the old stone walls that had stood through 100 other winters and would stand through 100 more, was the steadiness she had almost stopped believing she deserved. She had come to Ashburn Hall to be useful. She had stayed because it became, without her permission or her planning, entirely and irrevocably home. And so had he. And there, at last, is the story of Eliza Vane, a woman who arrived at a ruined estate alone and quietly rebuilt it into something extraordinary, and in doing so, rebuilt the guarded, wounded Duke who had never known what it meant to belong somewhere until she showed him. If this story moved you, stayed with you, or felt like exactly what you needed today, we would be so grateful if you would leave a comment below, share this with someone who loves a slow burn romance, and subscribe to this channel for more deeply emotional historical love stories delivered every week. Your presence here means more than you know.